those of you who are For those of you who are joining us for spring semester for the first time, welcome to the California Fire Science Seminar Series, and welcome as well to those of you who joined us in the fall on our Thursday time, and of course we've now moved to Tuesdays. I'm Crystal Colden at University of California, Merced. My co-hosts for this seminar series are Dr. Jeanette Kobiani-Nikas, also from University of California, Merced, and Dr. Michael Gallner at the University of California, Berkeley. And Berkeley has kindly hosted this seminar series this year in partnership with the California Fire Science Consortium. Today's speaker we'll get to in just a moment. A little bit of housekeeping to begin with. This is a webinar, so all of our listeners, participants are muted and you're not able to ask questions verbally during the webinar. What we ask is that if you have a question for our speaker, that you look at the bottom of your screen where there is a Q&A button on the bar on the bottom of your screen, and that any questions you may have during the talk, that you type them into the Q&A, and we will have a few minutes at the end of the talk to answer some questions. And then, of course, we will move at 4 o'clock to a discussion Zoom room, and the link for that room will be placed into the chat during the talk, and closer to the end we'll put it in there again just to make sure that everybody's got the link to move over to the discussion Zoom, where we will have an opportunity to answer any unanswered questions from the Q&A during this webinar, and also any additional questions that you may have, and our speaker will be able to sort of just answer those and talk a little bit about her work. And with that, I will go ahead and introduce today's speaker. We are absolutely thrilled to welcome Dr. Toddy Steelman, who is now being interrupted by my dog. Sorry about that. Who is the Stanback Dean of the Nicholas School of Environment at Duke University. Prior to that, she served for 5 years as the Executive Director and Professor at the School of Environment and Sustainability in the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon, Canada. She works at the intersection of science, policy, and decision-making, and her expertise in environment and natural resource policy is well recognized nationally, internationally. She, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and just
fans everywhere. What can I say?
Since my dog has decided to have a day with me. In any case, thank you very much for joining us today, Toddy, and I will let you take it away.
Very good. Well, thank you so very much, Crystal. I think my dog's going to get into the act too. She's stirred up. She's sitting here with me, and what a real pleasure to be here today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen out. We test drove it here just a few minutes ago, so it should work all just fine and good. I just want to say thank you so very much for the opportunity to be here today to present. I want to say thanks to Crystal, and thanks to Jeanette, and thanks to Michael, to all of you for organizing this great public service that you do to sort of share knowledge broadly. I don't get to do as much of this kind of presenting these days, in part because of the demands on me as a dean. And the time that I do have to spend on wildfire work is really concentrated on my work as the president of the International Association for Wildland Fire. So thank you for this amazing opportunity to actually talk about my own research, and I really welcome the opportunity. So I want to set the stage just a little bit before I get started about my scholarship and the topic that I have for you today. So, so one of the things I'm talking to you about wildfire futures, potential paths for change. One of the things I typically talk about as dean, I feel that often, you know, in a school, I'm a dean of the School of the Environment, and in the media, what we often end up seeing, social media, conventional media, everything else, are these narratives of despair. And I encourage folks in our school basically instead to engage into some narratives of hope. I feel like we have an obligation to the next generation of scholars and students and the public out there to point the way to what is possible, because if they can't get it from us, who else are they going to get it from? Now, this is not to say that the world is filled with rainbows and unicorns and butterflies. It clearly is not. But I do think we have an obligation basically to try to find these narratives of hope and possibility. So that's partly what I want to do for you all today. The key question that I have explored throughout my career is how do we improve natural resource governance? And Crystal pointed to this a little bit ahead of time. I would say that one of the primary contributions of my scholarship have been to investigate collaboration as an alternative to more hierarchical forms of governance when dealing with complex natural resources. And I investigate these issues through the lens of institutions and decisions and behaviors using a variety of qualitative and quantitative social science methodologies. And so that's just a little bit about what I do. And since 2000, I have explored these issues really through the prism or the crucible of wildfire. And so I see myself as part of the lineage of those who have really contributed to the body of knowledge related to social science and wildfire. And prior to the 2000s, the study of wildfire really rested predominantly with the biophysical sciences and engineers. However, in the late 1990s, wildfires started emerging as a greater threat to people inhabiting forested areas. And so these larger, more catastrophic fires were signaling a change in the environment, and more human communities were being affected by these fires. So in 2001, the National Wildland Fire Coordinating Group commissioned a study to direct social science research given the pressing issues that were starting to arise. And that's the reference to the book by Gary Matchless in 2002. And at the time that that book was written in 2002, there were only 300 articles and books that existed that related to human dimensions in fire. So I think that's really quite amazing because today, that scholarship is much, much larger. But I think it's just sort of an interesting part of the history. So that's just a little bit about me and my scholarship. I want to set the stage for the problem that I'm going to talk about today. So hot, dry, and windy weather leads to big fires. And models suggest that we're going to see more intense weather events, which means more concentrated rainfall events, and perhaps counterintuitively, more rain-free days and higher maximum wind speeds. So we're going to see more concentrated rainfall, more rain-free days, drought, and higher maximum wind speeds, hot, dry, windy. And we know that climate is driving part of this change that we see in wildland fire behavior. We also know that human intervention, whether it's in settlement patterns or natural resource management, also have exacerbated the challenges that we now face with wildfire. So these are very complex systems. And one of the key questions is, what can we do about that? So let's start with two questions. What do you need to start a fire? Fuel, an ignition source or heat, and oxygen. So that's the fire triangle that you see up there in front of you. And then let's ask a second question. How is climate changing wildfire? So let's start with changes to fuel. Warming and drought causes vegetation to dry out. And drier fuels basically means it's more ready to burn. So fire weather season length and fire weather season severity have increased over the past 40 years. And so this means that fire season is longer, and in some cases approaching a fire year, which you all in California know a lot about, especially given how windy and dry it is there today. And so you know exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about that. And just to clarify, today I'm going to be talking mostly about the United States and particularly the Western United States, but this is not just an issue clearly facing the United States or the Western United States. So climate change makes bushfires in Australia, and just over a year ago, Australia was facing the largest, worst fire season it had ever experienced. So climate change makes bushfires in Australia and wildfires in Greece more likely. It makes the fire conditions more extreme. And so, you know, we've seen changes in Australia and the United Kingdom and Alaska and Siberia and the Amazon and Indonesia. And, you know, even in 2016, we saw an historic fire in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, the Chimney Tops 2 fire that took 14 lives. It forced the evacuation of 14,000 people and consumed over 2,000 structures. So it's not just the western part of the United States. Similar fires could easily happen in Wisconsin or Michigan or New Jersey. So back to our regular programming, warming is causing longer fire seasons, which puts vegetation and trees under more stress, which makes them more ready to burn. So we have a double whammy when it comes to fuels. We have warming and drought, plus a longer duration of time during which they are under stress and can burn. So that's what's happening in the fuels sort of category. Now, I would be terribly remiss if I didn't also mention that decades of forest and fire management, or perhaps mismanagement, have also contributed to the challenges that we face. So land use management, along with wildfire suppression, have resulted in ecosystems that are really out of whack with the historical ranges in terms of burning cycles. And that results in a buildup of fuels that create really ripe conditions for wildfire. So in addition to fuels, you need heat and a spark to start a fire. So what are the common ignition sources? So with wildfires, the two most common are lightning and people. So more heat results in more lightning. And there are studies out there that project an increase in global lightning with climate change. So lightning is found to be seen positively correlated with surface temperature on short time scales. So that's just sort of one of those trends. But humans also cause fires. And in the United States, 84% of all wildfires are human caused and account for the expansion of wildfire season. And those are especially in the shoulder seasons, spring and into the fall. So in June, July, and August, we see lightning started fires. And in the shoulder seasons, we see more human caused fires. So people and dry fuel cause longer fire seasons. And of course, these patterns are different regionally and across the world. So the upshot here is that climate change is affecting wildfire, and it will continue to affect wildfire, but it's not the whole story. To this mix, we add humans, because at the end of the day, we wouldn't really care this much about wildfire if humans weren't as affected. So the confluence of more wealth and retiring baby boomers enabled more people to move to or retire to these beautiful forested places, the wildland urban interface, right? And as more people moved to these areas, the need to protect them became all the more pressing. So it's no coincidence that as more people have moved into the wildland urban interface, that more structures are being lost. And Headwaters Economics, they're a little nonprofit research shop up in Montana, estimates that since 2005, nearly 90,000 structures have been destroyed. In California, you lead the way here. 8 of the top 10 most destructive wildfires have occurred in California. I don't think that surprises anybody. Fires are getting bigger, and we are seeing trends towards fewer fires, but bigger fires. Now, this last year bucked that trend just a little bit. So these are data that just basically came from the end of fire season this year. So this last year, we saw 57,000 total fires. The 10-year average is right around 56,000. So we had been seeing a trend towards fewer fires. This year bucked this trend a little bit. And we have definitely been seeing trends towards more acres burning, larger fires. So this year, new record, 10.3 million acres. The 10-year rolling average is 6.6. So fires are getting bigger. So this means more complex more than 10 million acres as well. So these are trends that we are generally seeing overall. So what do we do about this? We know we have a very big complex problem that involves both people and weather and climate and landscapes and vegetation. It's a very complex system, and it's a difficult problem that has been growing over the last 100 years. So it's going to take us a little while to work our way out of it. It's important for us to set our expectations consistent with the scope of the problem that we face. And there are a lot of good efforts underway, and these have been underway for some time. And in the United States, our dominant policy is called the National Cohesive Strategy. So if you look over the past 25 years at all the different policies that have been crafted to address the wildfire problem, you will see a whole bunch of them, and I have them all listed up here. And if you were to group them, which I have done, you would see that there are basically 5 key themes that emerge out of all of these policies. So, reduce hazardous fuels, build fire adapted communities, restore fire adapted ecosystems, make sure we are, fostering agency coordination and community cooperation, respond appropriately to wildfires. So we know what we need to do, and we have been asserting that for 25 years. So it's not a matter of knowing what we need to do. And I think this is really important because the consequences are real, and we have different alternative futures that we could realize. So on one hand, and this is perhaps the narrative of despair, we could see more extreme fire, where we transition to a 12-month fire season with higher return rate intervals, rising fuel levels, with a public that's losing faith, communities that are overwhelmed, and public health concerns, due to these high smoke levels. Alternatively, we have another future that we could be looking towards, where fires create windows of opportunities for us to get more fire on the landscape. And communities have successfully adapted to coexist with fire. We have higher public confidence, more prescribed burning, and smoke issues and public health issues are on the decline. And then the question then is, how do we get there? What leads to more effective implementation if we know how to get there? If we know where we need to go, how do we get there? And what leads to more effective implementation? So how does change take place? The thesis of a book that I wrote a few years back called Implementing Innovation was that innovations or new practices were adopted when you had alignment among three different areas: individuals who were motivated and working within clear social norms that supported their innovation, structures that supported the innovation with clear rules and communication incentives in a supportive environment, and then finally, a culture, a broader culture that was supportive or could capitalize on change opportunities to create legitimacy for that innovation. So I want to unpack this just a little bit. So in terms of culture, what does it mean? We are enmeshed in cultural frames that constrain our imagination of what is possible, right? Or what is possible in terms of change. So change most likely happens when you have something called a framing event or a shock to the system, such as when a disaster resets your mind to the realm of possibility. And we could think about a civil insurrection, for instance, that happened 2 weeks ago that really reset a lot of people's minds about what could happen in this country. Or in our case, climate change. And that's what's important for wildfire. Second, we have structures, all right? Structures are the rules, laws, and norms that guide us. So we have policies and practices and procedures that are part of these norms and laws. That's basically what frames our sense of what we do in terms of our behavior. And then finally, you have individuals that move the ball forward. So they are clearly an important part of the puzzle. Like, who is going to be that champion that wakes up every day thinking about a given issue, let's say hazardous fuel breaks, and continues to move that particular effort forward? Really important. So again, when we have alignment in these three broad areas, then we have the greatest probability for change to take place. Now, on top of this, in the realm of wildfire, this is complicated by the multiple and interdependent temporal and spatial scales that are part of the Wildland Fire Challenge. So we can't purely think about wildfire as a social problem or as an ecological problem. They have elements of both. It's what makes them fun to think about. So let's map onto this. How do we get change with this notion of culture, structures, and individuals? So if we bring these two frames together, how does change take place mapped onto the different scales? Then we can imagine a system where cultural values are more universal. And so, for instance, let's say a shift from thinking about suppression-only culture to something that is more flexible due to the variety of challenges of suppression only. And second, to this, we would add structures at each of these levels that we would need to facilitate a change that that would need to be tailored to what was appropriate at the local, tribal, state, national, regional level. And here, in some ways, you could think about federal air quality rules or state level rules for prescribed burning or something like that, right? All of it needs to be aligned. And then finally, you would want to see key individuals championing the effort at all of those different levels to keep the initiative moving forward. So this is a very high level conceptual theory of change, right? How does change happen? We have to bring into alignment culture, structures, and individuals across all of these spatial and temporal scales in order for it to happen, because it's a big problem. Okay, so that's good. The national policy that we have for doing this is called the cohesive strategy. And it is comprised of three parts: creating fire adapted communities. In other words, how can we coexist with more fire on the landscape? Creating more resilient landscapes. In other words, how can we create healthier ecosystems that can support fire? And working towards more safe and effective wildfire response. So how can we take appropriate risks to protect the people and places we care about? And I have spent my career basically working on these first two areas, fire adapted communities and safe and effective wildland fire responses. So let me just share with you a little bit about what I've done in those areas. So on fire adapted communities, I've worked in the realm of community preparedness and mitigation, and then also citizen agency communication. And when it comes to safe and effective wildland fire response, I've done work around community agency interactions, community information needs and outreach, and fire management and public response. So that's just a little bit about where I've done my work. And I want to just give you like the Cliff Notes version of 15 years of work. So what a bargain this is for you. All right, in terms of community preparedness, what we see is huge variation among communities. So just like we think about a concept of a mosaic to represent diversity and health at the landscape level, we can also think about social mosaics. In other words, the goodness of fit of the appropriate structures, those policy and tools, are needed for action in the right communities. So there's no one size fits all, just like there's no one size fits all in nature. So we need to appreciate that social mosaics necessitate differential approaches for what will work in a given community. So what will work in Ruidoso, New Mexico, will likely not work as well in Boulder, Colorado. And so we've got a whole bunch of literature. And again, this is a tiny snapshot of what that has been when we think about what do we need to do when we think about community preparedness. And again, when it comes to wildfire management, that second bucket in the cohesive strategy, just a little bit of work that we've done in this area in the realm of wildfire management. How do we manage, and that means how do we manage fire on the ground when it's actually happening? And this is just another Cliff Notes version of another 10 years of work. We know that pre-fire planning is associated with more flexible wildfire management. So when we work ahead of time, we get more options for what we can do with fire on the ground when it happens. We also know that pre-fire communication is associated with more effective wildland fire response during the fire. In other words, when people have talked and have a game plan ahead of the fire, then people are much more satisfied with the response that they get. Finally, my colleague Brandon Knoll at North Carolina State University and I have pioneered the concept of what we call the Wildfire Responder Network. And that takes a little bit more of explaining. So I'm going to unpack that a little bit more. So, you know, I think, actually, I'm going to skip over that one. So historically, so I'm going to unpack this idea of a wildland fire network. Historically, we have managed fires through hierarchical organizations. So that's the diagram on the right, that, you know, ICS, something called ICS, the Incident Command System, that hierarchical organization. And a hierarchical structure with very top-down decision-making is really important when you have a fire bearing down on your community, right? You want to be able to make decisions very quickly, and you have a very clear chain of command, and you can get things done very, very quickly. So that's important. Problem is that the social complexity involved in wildfires these days means we need to think about new organizational structures to manage these complex networks very differently. Because our fires look different, we will continue to look different, and we need our human organizational to look different, right? So this kind of goes back to the beginning part of the talk where I was talking about, look how complex fires are getting. So let me sort of reiterate that. So historically, a big fire would be about 10,000 acres and involve one agency, right? The Forest Service, let's just say by way of example. Today, a big fire is 150,000 acres or 800,000 acres, or in the case of some fires, 1,000,000 acres, and involve many, many, many different agencies from the local, state, tribal, federal, as well as nonprofits related to sheltering and mass care and animal evacuations and businesses, right? So it's a much, much more complex proposition. Once upon a time, it used to be all anyone had to worry about when they were managing a fire was just managing the fire management. But today, with a large fire, you have a lot more to manage, right? You have to think about utilities and evacuation and public information and tribal relations and structure protection and road closures and sheltering and mass care and animal evacuations and local, state, and national politicians. That is a lot of complexity to manage, right? And so, you know, the kind of fire organization or the kind of wildfire response network that you need is much, much different. So what we need are fire management structures that can deal with increased complexity of the task at hand. And we need the complexity of the social structure to match the complexity of the wildfire reality on the ground. And so we have developed this idea of the wildfire response network that drew from real-time effort on fires, basically to catalog who was showing up, what they were doing to understand the full complexity of response. And so that's just, again, a little bit of a snapshot of where our research has been. So when we think about structures and what might be more adaptable to a changing wildland fire environment, we need our organizational and governance structures to match the complexity of the task. So this kind of takes us back to this idea of culture, structures, and individuals. These are the kind of structures that we need. So you may be scratching your head and saying, Toddy, you've been talking a lot and using lots of words and concepts. What does all of this mean? Yes, I have taken you on a Cliff Notes version of a portion of my academic career. So where is all this going? Let me tell you. All right. So let's revisit. We know we have a complex wildfire problem. We know what we need to do. Policy has been pretty clear on that for a while. I laid out a model for how change can happen: culture, structures, individuals. We know that this is embedded in a spatial and temporal complexity. So what does that mean for us now? What are the options? All right. So let's talk about the cultural landscape with that in mind. We have a window of opportunity that has opened at the macro level in the United States and elsewhere, but especially in the United States as of tomorrow. People are finally paying attention because we have numerous focusing events like severe weather and their consequences like wildfire that have captured the attention of the American public and are leading them to believe that something different is needed. This is a very big cultural shift. So shocks, right? I talked about shocks and shifting the frame of reference. So, and this was before 2020, which was really started to see the needle shift on climate change. So for instance, the European Commission, President Ursula von der Leyen basically announced that a new Green Deal, which is going to be the centerpiece of the European Union Economic Recovery Plan. China announced a net zero pledge by 2060. We're going to have the change of the administration in the United States tomorrow. The public and private sectors have reached a tipping point on these issues. We see it everywhere. And disasters got worse this year. Wildfires, hurricanes, derecho, record heat in Phoenix, Siberia, the record number of disasters that cost $1 billion. So again, what we are seeing is an incredible historic window of opportunity opening during which we can make real change as it relates to wildland fire and the challenges that we face. So my argument is that real change will rest on bulldozing through the structural and institutional changes necessary to create this kind of enduring change. So what does that do? The window is open. What are the kind of institutions and structures that we will need to take the next step? So this slide's a little bit busy. But what we need to think about is climate change and landscape and vegetative change and how we respond with national, state, and local policy, right? So if we want to create enduring change, then what are the structures that we can move forward in the face of this historic window of opportunity, right? So what we see here is that, okay, we've got lots of things happening in terms of spatial and temporal interplay. And there are lots of things, again, this is a little bit busy, but I want to give you just a general sense of what this means. So at the international level, we need to support climate change mitigation efforts, including rejoining the Paris Accord and other multilateral efforts, right? So that's what we can do when we think about mitigation. At the national level, we need to invest in more prescribed fire capacity, fund things like the Collaborative Forest Restoration Program and the Joint Chiefs Landscape Restoration Partnership, develop and support better funding tools that provide multi-year commitments. At the regional or state level, we need landscape restoration projects, efforts kind of like the California Shared Stewardship Agreement, and to reinvest in the forest products industry. We need liability reform for prescribed fire, the Clean Air Act regulations, and prescribed fire councils. At the local level, we need more fire extension specialists. There's a really terrific pilot program taking place in Oregon right now with fire extension specialists out of their extension program in Oregon State. We need to increase prescribed fire capacity. We need new financial tools on the ground, like forest resilient bonds, these tools that basically put more financial resources in the hands of locals to actually get the on the ground, and more effective fire management structures like the things that I tackle in my own research. this is just a tiny, tiny bit of some of the things that we can do. And so what I think is exciting about the moment in time of where we are right now is that we have an opportunity, we have a complex problem, we know what to do, and there is this generational window of opportunity opening up. And at the end of the day, it's these structures that are really going to matter. It's the upshot of what I found in my research, both when we talk about community preparedness and when we talk about wildland fire management. And that's where we need to place our efforts if we're really going to take advantage of this particular window of opportunity. Structures matter. So now we need to be advocating for them at every single level. And that's where we really need to get to work. So with that in mind, I am happy to take any and all questions. And I will step back here a little bit and stop sharing.
Okay. Thank you so much, Toddy. This is every time I see you give a talk, I'm just like, I want to be like Toddy when I grow up. It's fantastic. Let's see. So folks, again, if you have questions for Toddy, we are using the Q&A. So at the bottom of your screen, please click on the Q&A button and type your question into the Q&A box. So the first question from Andrew is, have you seen the last minute executive order to form a wildfire management subcommittee? And if so, what are your thoughts on this?
Oh, I have not, but now I'm really excited to know what that is about. Let me tell you, if anybody knows about it and wants to put it in the chat, I'll be happy to comment on it. Or if somebody else knows about it in the chat, let us know.
Yeah, I have not actually had a chance to read it myself yet. I saw it last week come out of the White House, and sort of haven't figured I'd look again when the White House changed and see what was still there. Let's see. We have a question from Will. How do we leverage the time period post? Okay, let me see if I'm asking this right. How do we leverage the time period post human caused catastrophic wildfire to increase collaboration across sectors, including utility business, nonprofit government, rather than default to this sort of defensive posture to avoid financial liabilities and culpability, which tends to drive competition for scarce resources and the avoidance of longer term wildfire risk mitigation and overall climate solutions? And how do we ensure the short-term financial incentives of corporations don't infect and prevent our collective progress towards the long-term state? So it sounds like this is really this long-term versus short-term incentives question.
Absolutely. Really good question. And, how do we move from this reactive posture to a more proactive posture, right? So in the short term, when you're just always in the middle of, crisis management, gosh, it's so hard to even catch a breath so that you can actually get ahead of some of the work. And of course, right now, COVID really further compounds these issues, right? Because one of the things that we're seeing, and here I can wear my IAWF hat a little bit as president, one of the things that we're seeing is that we're hearing from our membership is that it's harder to get together pre-season to do the work that prepares you during season, or, even to get out and do your own prescribed burning, or to do the work ahead of time that's going to make things better for fire season. So we are managing multiple successive crises right now. So I think it's going to be really hard this year. So the upshot is we need to be doing more work ahead of fire season. That's not rocket science in terms of what we need to be doing. So the question is, how do we get to that point? The Funding Fire Fix, which came into effect this year, is supposed to provide a little bit of relief for our major federal agencies, so that they can actually allocate more resources and not have quite so many financial resources drawn away from their other missions. So I think that's a fix that took Congress many, many years to get to, right? And that's what I mean when we talk about structures. That's a really good structure that actually will put more resources into the kind of work that we need to get done ahead of fire season, build those collaborative relationships, and allow some of that work to move forward.
And Toddy, do you want to remind us really quick what the Funding Fire Fix is for those who don't know about it?
Sure. So the Wildfire Funding Fix was basically a piece of legislation that was passed 3 years ago, I believe now, because it's 2021, that basically said, we will no longer take money out of the Forest Service and the Department of Interior when we overspend during fire season. We're going to leave those budgets intact, and we're actually going to take money to fight fire out of a different fund. And so the problem is that every year when we spend more money on fighting wildfire during fire season, we raid all the accounts in the Forest Service and the Department of Interior and Department of Agriculture, which means they don't have the work left over to do their pre-fire mitigation work, right? To do hazardous fuels thinning, or to do work with communities on the ground, or do that other stuff that will help us dig us out of this vicious cycle that we're in. And so it was a bad vicious cycle. And now with that budget, the funding fix, they're trying to reverse that so that we don't cannibalize existing budgets that allow us to do that pre-fire work and the important land management work on the ground. So that's one thing that I think is good. And then, so we need funding to do it. That's important. And then we need, the person power, the men and women out there that can do the work ahead of fire season, build these partnerships. Like I said, in COVID times, this is even harder. I think we really need to be looking at next year and what we do. And then we need a little bit of a break from Mother Nature. 2019 gave us a little bit of a break. We didn't have as bad fire season here in the United States, which was good. It gave us some time to get some of that work done, but then COVID hit us. So we need a little bit of break from Mother Nature. We need more resources, the funding fire fix, and then more grit on the ground.
And your allusion to needing more people is a great intro to the next question from Susan of what are these fire extension specialists at Oregon State?
Yeah, so this is just a terrific, I don't know if Scott Stevens is on the call, but I've seen Scott write about these too, and appreciate that. So, and I've seen Scott make a call for California engaging in similar fire extension specialists. So Oregon State University has an extension arm, and part of what they're doing is dedicating personnel and capacity at that really crucial interface between sort of where universities do work and where the work happens on the ground with key communities and the individuals that get the work done. So these are sort of bridgers. They build bridges between, as an extension specialist from a university, to leverage the science and the knowledge of how we get this stuff done. Helps them connect with resources that can actually facilitate the work on the ground. And so they're the really important glue, I think, in this really complex jigsaw puzzle between the local work and the state level work.
Yeah, and I feel like you hired 4 of them, where 2 of them, I think both Dr. Chris Dunn and then Dr. Chris Adlam, who actually is a California person that came out of UC Davis, were both hired into those positions, as well as 2 other individuals that I don't know who it was. So really a great new program that it would be, I think, beneficial to states like California to look at. Mm-hmm. And we have a question here from Faraz asking, I read somewhere that the total acreage of burned area includes prescribed fire. Is that a true statement?
NIFC doesn't track it that way. NIFC tracks burned acres, and then they track prescribed fires separately. So if you go to NIFC, the National Interagency Fire Center, if you go to their website and look under their statistics tab, they track those 2 things separately. So I don't believe they are tracked together, unless there's something I'm missing there.
Yeah, I don't think so either. It's possible you saw a number somewhere for Oz where it was including prescribed fire, but generally those are in separate data, depending on where you're looking at. Let's see, we have a question from Juan. Do other countries have easy applicable lessons? For example, is Baja California fire management better than California?
I don't know, but that sounds like a great research project. Should we go do that? I think we should go do that. I would love to go spend some time in Baja and find out if that's true. Comparative research, of course, is incredibly important, and the kind of comparative research that I've seen when it comes, so I'll talk to the 2 areas that I know about: community preparedness and then wildfire management. Community preparedness, like we have good examples in Australia that we know about community preparedness. We have good examples in Canada. I think it's fair to say that broad scale lessons travel well. We see certain kinds of innovations, but then context matters an awful lot. And we have really interesting a different constitution here in the United States than we have up in Canada, and different things are permissible under our property rights than are not permissible in other places, and vice versa. So there are limits sometimes to how far those lessons can travel. And I would say the same thing is true from wildland fire management. I think we always have a lot to learn from each other. And I would say that's one of the things that we really try to do in the International Association of Wildland Fire. One of our main jobs is to try to have convenings where we can capitalize on these kinds of lessons and learn from each other. So I'm going to see how clever I am. I'm putting in a plug for my organization all at the same time.
We have a question from Dave who asks, can we get the list of papers cited in the presentation? And Dave, I will note that I'm pretty sure that Toddy actually cited everything in her PowerPoint. And these webinars are usually within a day or two posted up to the website for the seminar series, California Fire Science Seminar Series. So I would encourage you to have a look at that. And if you are not familiar with Toddy's impressive body of work with her many collaborators, you're on Google Scholar and just about everywhere, I think. Yes,
for sure. And I've got a list. You know, we have a Fire Chasers website too that has everything, and I can send that link as well. I'm happy to send it out.
Okay. And let's see. Oh, Marty Alexander. Speaking of Canadians, Toddy, what are your thoughts on education in the school system?
So that's just a small question, Marty? And by that, I presume you mean sort of like, how do we educate kids coming up so they understand their fire ecology and what's happening, and how do we educate, people about what's happening around us? So I would go almost back to that temporal and spatial scale diagram that I had about the things that we want our students to know about. I'll tell you that there was a really amazing, I did some work back in 2004 in a variety of communities across the United States to try to understand what they were doing related to community preparedness. And I'm not going to remember which community it was in. I think it was in New Mexico. Had this unbelievable module that they had put into their elementary school system, where they not only were educating students about the fire ecology and the fire return intervals in their own area, but they were taking kids out on the land and showing them sort of what happened when a place burned or when it didn't burn, or what does a fire adapt, what does a defensible home look like? Really, really interesting stuff of integrating stuff into local schools and into their curricula. Also, when I was in Canada, working up in Saskatchewan, we had done some work with local communities, basically to start a curriculum in one of the place called Cumberland House, to work on how do you become a firefighter, right? And so this was a First Nations community, a Métis community, basically, that wanted to be working on putting more fire into the land and trying to figure out how they could do more work on the land. And so they just started, they said, how can we basically incorporate that into our curriculum? And so that's what they've done. They have created a process basically where one can become a firefighter right into their curriculum. So I think it's a great idea, Marty. There's some really exciting things that are happening both in Canada and the United States. I think we need more of it.
There is a number of great new books and coloring books, and there's a woman on Twitter whose name I can't remember. She goes by Pyro Sketchology on Twitter, and she's done a number of great coloring sheets for kids, which I know is a parent of small children. We have a question from Stacy. Any thoughts on how scientists and researchers can be advocates for science-based policies without, quote, stepping over the line, unquote?
Yeah, I think that all resides with your own general personal level of comfort in terms of how comfortable you are taking your own science into the realm where it steps over policy, right? So, science and the kind of science you do will suggest that there are certain actions one can take to perhaps lead to better community preparedness or lead to better wildland fire management. And I think it's really clear to be explicit when you're talking as a scientist. And then there are other times when we are out in the public sphere, when we are not talking as scientists, we are talking as pure citizens. And I think when you take your scientist hat off, you should be very explicit about it. And perhaps when you're putting your citizen hat on, you should also be very explicit about it, because we're also humans. and we have opinions. And so I guess I would just be really clear about where does your science stop in terms of what it recommends, and then where does your human citizen person start, so that you're at least clear in yourself about when you're doing those different things and not overstepping boundaries.
And we have a question from Amelia, who asks or says, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. Can you please talk more about the Wildfire Response Network and how will that be organized?
So I think the Wildfire Response Network is sort of theoretical. It was, we went, the work that Brandon Knoll and I and our research team have done, basically we go out and we embed ourselves on National Incident Command teams and try to understand how they are managing these large fires, right? And so we captured that based on a variety of things that we observed and some social network analysis that we did. So I think it's important to recognize that the diagram that I showed you is what we call a quote unquote ideal network. And that in general, it exemplifies the complexity that exists out on a fire. And every fire will look a little bit different. The thesis behind our work is that as long as we carry around a mental model of this hierarchy, we're going to be missing something, because the network is so much more complicated because of the complexity of the system in which it's embedded, that we have to really take that into account. And so what we have done is to try to work with incident commanders across the United States for the last many years to get them to change their mental models about how they see the complexity of incidents. The incident command system will always be there, but they have to understand, and of course they do understand this. I wouldn't presume to, think I know how to do their jobs better than they do. But I think what our data suggests, and this is me putting on, here's where this is what the data say. These are very complex systems. And because fires are bigger, they cover more jurisdictions, the kind of social complexity that these incident commanders face has to be taken into account. And so we've just tried to move our research into those arenas where it can be most utilized by those who are actually out on the ground managing these fires. And so that's kind of how we have tried to tie together sort of the theory with the practice, with the management on the ground. So that's how we hope that gets used, Amelia. At least that is our hope.
I'll ask you a little bit of a follow-up on that, because I think what I'm hearing is that the goal has been to try and get sort of a better understanding of complexity on the incident management side from the fire managers.
Yeah.
And in your work, have you seen a big difference between how the incident managers have to change their mental maps and networks versus how some of those other components that may not necessarily have ever thought they would be part of that network, like the utilities, like water managers, exactly, like other types of folks? How is that group of individuals really having to deal with this differently than, for example, incident managers in terms of becoming part of that network?
Well, it goes both ways, right? And so not only do incident commanders have to see the entire picture of what they're managing, the people that run the railroads, the people that run the utilities, the people that run, all of the air quality monitoring boards have to see themselves as part of the response too. And so one of the ways that usually happens on a complex incident is through something called, a stakeholders meeting. So when the fire is running hot and heavy, if you're out on an incident command post, basically they'll have a meeting where they have all the key stakeholders come. And eventually word gets around about, if you want to know what's happening on the fire, you should be at this meeting. And so that's one of the ways that we, as a social science, radio collar people and try to figure out where they are and where they're going. And that's how we identify them, is when they show up at these meetings, like, okay, who are you and what are you doing? And so it's a road that goes both ways. And I think that's also what is more complicated, is that fires don't respect political jurisdictions. They don't care. And yet all of that is something that needs to be managed. And, another part of that is we were on a fire back in 2013 where you had very active county commissioners who didn't want to be part of what was going on. They wanted to do their own thing. And so that really creates a lot of complicating factors for an incident commander who's trying to run a holistic organization. And then you've got political entities that just want to break off and do their own thing. That makes it really, really hard. So everybody ultimately has to see themselves as part of the big picture of pulling together if you're going to be effective in managing it. And I would say that's where some of our other research comes in. The more communication you are doing ahead of a fire to understand who's in your fire shed and how you get those people together ahead of time will make it much easier to bring all that together during the fire.
We have a question from Sharon who asks, your national and regional ideas sound just like what Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, and the Western governors have all been advocating in terms of funding, et cetera. So why has this been so hard? And what do you think needs to change to not just end up on the hamster wheel going round and round in the same spot?
Absolutely. And I would say, yep, you're absolutely right. Like this is, we know what to do. It's not a mystery, right? So you'll see the same things. What's different right now, I would say a little bit different than the last few years, is that we do have this big window of opportunity opening. We have I think we're going to have an administration that's a little bit pending. I don't know what this executive order is about. I'm really curious to see what that's about. So you've really piqued my curiosity with that. But I think that we're going to see an opportunity, like this window of opportunity is open for us to move forward with some of these efforts, right? So typically, when you get action, we know what to do, the window opens, and then we can move those ideas forward. So we know what to do. So I think that the opportunity is right. There has been lots of great work going on in lots of different places. Like if you look at a map of where, for instance, Lake Tahoe was 15 years ago in terms of what defensible space looked like around Lake Tahoe and the whole ring of sort of defensible work that they have done, it would look very different than it does today 15 years later. It takes 15 years to make a dent in the kind of problems that we face. So it's not a failure. And this is where I get back to this idea of narratives of hope and possibility instead of narratives of despair and destruction, is we have to understand the scale and the scope of the magnitude that we're trying to dig our way out of. It is a problem of 100 years magnitude. 15 years is what you really need to look at in order to make a difference. So when we see projects like what we see at, Lake Tahoe, we can see that, yeah, we are making a difference there. And I think those are the kind of projects we need to continue to identify. Some of these collaborative forest restoration projects, I think in the next 5 years or so, are really going to start to also sort of show these kind of benefits. So it's not a failure. It's basically, we need to keep our foot to the gas pedal right now more than ever if we're really going to, hit the tipping point and making in terms of making a difference.
We have a question from Nicholas who asks, when you talk about forest product industries, what does that exactly entail? And how do we do that sustainably while not creating industries that end up contributing to emissions and other environmental waste?
Really great question. So, I mean, and this gets to be a bit controversial, like, aren't they part of the problem? Well, yeah, they have been part of the problem, but they're also a really important part of the solution, because there's no way for us to get the kind of fuels off of the forest unless we have a sustainable forest products industry. And I think, I hope we have learned how to do some of this better since the 1970s and 80s, which I think were the height of where we were seeing some really terrible practices. And I think industry has learned since then. And so when we have things like collaborative stewardship projects, which are ways for us to pay to take off fuels that are not merchantable, but then people can still make a living from those. I think that those are opportunities for us to basically figure out how we can provide sustainable products over the longer term so that local communities can also benefit from what ultimately has to happen through all of these restoration efforts in our forests. So how do we move from just sort of a forest profit economy to a forest for profit and restoration economy? There's a lot of really great writing out there, and I think we've got a lot of good watchdog organizations that can sort of help us get there. And I think it absolutely has to be part of our future solutions.
We have a question from Tyler. who is asking, Dr. Steelman, you described a number of important areas that ought to be addressed at local, regional, national levels in order to best catalyze change. Given the interrelated nature of all these structures, do you see certain leverage points that should be considered a priority to help facilitate the other changes you outlined?
That is a very good and strategic question, and I think it will be different in every state based on the priorities and, quite frankly, the areas that are at greatest risk. So I would say I would use a risk management framework to sort of say, where do we have the greatest risk and how can we start to prioritize protection of those particular areas? And of course, I look at this through a human dimensions lens. And so that's the prism that I would take on that. But it's going to be very different in every different state. And you know, California has been doing some really great strategic thinking about this. But the answer to your question, Tyler, is absolutely yes, but it's going to be very different. And the way that the feds can help with some of this, so like the feds can make resources available so that states can take advantage of those, so that, and then this is where we kind of get back to this idea, if we had a core of fire extension specialists that could then take those resources and really implement them on the local level while working with local communities, you can really start to see how all of that could come together.
And I think you sort of segued into another question here, which is simply put, what would be the role of a fire extension specialist? And is this something that we could offer as training at schools in California?
I think that would be a great program. I mean, I think it would be super. I mean, you know, how can we train more people to do this kind of work, right? Yeah. Not just to know how to do fire suppression, but how do we do forest restoration? How do we do more prescribed burning? How do we, you know, learn how to communicate effectively with local publics? How do we figure out behavioral incentives and working with people who want to do defensible space, right? It's all of these sorts of things. Like, we need generalists who are these extension specialists, not just these extension specialists who are generalists, I guess is what I'm saying. Pre-fire, during fire, post-fire.
And I think we'll do one last question here as we have about 3 minutes. And just a quick reminder, folks, the link to move over to the discussion section where I'm frantically trying to copy and paste questions from the Q&A. So we'll continue having interactive discussion and answering questions with Toddy. And the link for that is in the chat portion of the Zoom. But the last question for now from Charles is, from a crisis management, mitigation, and other perspective, do wildland fire disasters differ in a significant way from other types of disasters like floods, hurricanes, earthquakes? And obviously they differ in detail, but from a really broad perspective, how do they differ?
That's a really interesting question. The first observation I would make is that we don't have hurricane fighters, we don't have tornado fighters, we don't have earthquake fighters, but we do have firefighters. And I think the examples of the fires that you cited are perfectly good examples of when we get fires that are of a certain size, it is sheer folly and hubris to think that we can put people in the way to stop them. And we really need to get a lot smarter about where and when and how we can actually have an impact on these huge fires and the kind of fire behavior and severity that we're seeing out of them. So short answer is, are they different? Of course they're different, but then even within fires, we have smaller fires where traditional fire management tools work. We have larger fires where we are completely powerless. And it's really hard for the communities that are being hammered by a fire to understand that. They typically want us to put more planes on them, more people out there, and they get angry when that doesn't happen. So this in some ways gets back to the educational effort. Like 15 years ago, we would have thought that fire management, basically, there are heroes, they can do anything and they can help us. Today, we are really seeing, I was on a fire out in California in 2018, standing with 2 incident commanders. And we were just talking about the fire that we were on. And I looked up to one of the incident commanders and he just shook his head. He's like, I've been doing this 35 years. And he says, we are seeing stuff on the ground where we don't have slides in our decks, like we don't have anything in our brains that is preparing us for what we're seeing now. And I think it's really challenging because these are men and women who have devoted their lives to fighting fire, and they just realize that they are up against conditions that, you know, that just their careers have not prepared them for. And so it's really hard. So fires are also different just because they, you know, depending on the, you know, an earthquake comes and it's over in a few seconds. A flood comes, we usually have a lot of warning. We can know it's coming for days and days. Fires can happen, boom, like that, right? And just be on top of you. Think about Paradise and Campfire. So there's some dimensionalities to disasters and fires that are very different from hurricanes or tornadoes, and floods and those sorts of things. And which means we just need to think about them very, very differently.
Okay, would you please all join me in virtually thanking Dr. Toddy Steelman for an absolutely fantastic webinar and discussion. And for those of you that might have missed part of it, again, this will be, it was recorded and will be posted on the website in a couple days. And the link for moving over to the continuation of this discussion is in the chat box. Please click on that and we're all going to go ahead and move over to the discussion. We'll see you in a minute, and hopefully we'll see you again next week at the 3 o'clock time for our next speaker.
Awesome. Crystal, I don't know where that is, that link.
So if you go over to the chat box, and if you're on the bottom bar, you just click the, I think it's the participants, either participants or chat. I see it when I click on participants and it gives me the whole list of folks, and then below that there's a chat.
Yeah, there should be a chat little opening bubble, and if you don't see it, I emailed it to you as well, Toddy, just in case.
Okay, I'll find, oh, there it is, I see it. I got it now, thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome, I'll see you
so
there.
we'll just bump over and it'll take
we'll
a minute to start up.
Thank you.
Bye.
And I think I got everything copied. All right. There we go. Okay. And hopefully, oh, and there's Toddy. Okay, great. All right. So thank you all. Whoops. See if I unmute. There we go. All right. So thank you all for joining us over on the discussion side. It takes everybody just a minute to get on board. And